In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Samurai Sniper build. This is an all-game build that focuses on using the Nagakiba, one of my favorite weapons in this game, but also in using the Albinauric Bow. This is a bow that we covered in our bows video recently, and let me show you why I want to use it in this build and why I think it's so good in this game. So the general concept for this build came about when I was testing bows during the bows video, and what I realized when I was testing Sky Shot was that when you hit the heads of enemies with Sky Shot, it would actually outperform Mighty Shot, even though the amount of damage multiplier it had was lower. It's just headshots in general deal more damage. And so I kept thinking, how do I get Sky Shot to work effectively all the time so that I can use it instead of Mighty Shot and one-shot enemies? And this led me to the discovery, for some reason that I hadn't discovered previously, that you can aim and use Mighty Shot at the same time, and when you hit an enemy in the head while aiming with Mighty Shot, you get the headshot damage and the damage multiplier from Mighty Shot, and you can absolutely wreck enemies in very few arrows. So naturally, we then use Mighty Shot on our Albinauric Bow, and the reason that we use the Albinauric Bow for this build is because it scales the best out of all bows with dexterity. And one of the things about lightning arrows in Elden Ring is that they increase in damage with your dexterity. So the higher your dexterity is, the more damage your lightning arrows are going to deal, and since our bow natively scales with dexterity, it's a really, really good pairing. And something I also discovered was that even if you have lower attack rating, let's say you put more points into dexterity on a bow, but you have 5 less attack power than if you had put points in strength, and you use lightning arrows, you will generally still come out ahead with them damage-wise. So that's why we're using the Albinauric Bow, because of the dexterity scaling. We're using lightning arrows because of the dexterity scaling, and we're using a lightning Nagakiba because of the dexterity scaling. So all of these work together to have nice dexterity scaling and a nice lightning theme. And the Ash of War I have on my weapon is Lightning Slash. This is one that can take a little bit to get if you don't know where to go. But what this does is it sort of does this attack that follows up with a lightning bolt and then buffs your weapon with lightning damage. So you get even more damage on your weapon, and you do a lot of damage with a single attack. So it works out fantastically with this, and you buff your weapon at the same time. And what I really love about this build, and why I think this is a fantastic build to go into Shadow the Erdtree with, is that unlike some of the other builds that I've showcased that really decimate bosses, this build has a bit more of a focus on exploration. Because you have that bow that can pick off enemies at range, your exploration is going to be a bit easier. As it stands now in Elden Ring, I've been through the game so many times that exploration is not a problem for me. But as you make your way through Shadow the Erdtree and you don't know what to expect because you've never been there before, having a ranged option that can one-shot enemies and thin out enemies before you get into dangerous situations is going to make exploration much easier, even if the boss fights themselves are not as easy, because this build is maybe a little less easy to use in boss fights than some of the other builds I have made. You'll also notice that I have the Erdtree seal here. I don't meet the requirements for that. It doesn't matter. All I have here is Golden Vow to buff our damage further. I don't use this all that often, but you can use it on the landscape if you need to buff your arrow damage more, or your attacks in general when you go into boss fights. You, of course, won't focus on Faith early on in the game if you're playing this build near the beginning. This is something that you would do towards the end of your first playthrough or in the beginning of New Game Plus in order to add more damage to your build. When you're sitting at 80 dexterity like we are with this build, there isn't really a lot of room to grow damage-wise, because lightning scaling doesn't have great dexterity scaling after 80. Strength is terrible, and the same goes for your bow. It doesn't scale well after 80 dexterity, so the natural progression then is to add points in Faith to gain Golden Vow to boost both your arrow damage and your weapon damage. So then for armor for this build, I have the Okina Mask for extra dexterity. You'll see on my stats I have 83 dexterity, but you should probably put your dexterity at 77, so this comes out at 80. I have the Ronin armor chest piece. I have, I think, a red main gauntlet there, and then the Ronin legs, and that combined with the Bulgat's Talisman gives me enough poise that I can tank a hit. Now, you don't have to wear that armor. This is for fashion because we're going for a samurai build. I love the way this looks in this build. Definitely 10 out of 10 style points. But if you were min-maxing this build, you would use something that already has 51 poise, and you would free up that talisman slot. So other talismans that I use for this build are the Arrow's Sting Talisman to further boost our arrow damage, Ritual Sword Talisman to further boost our damage when at full health, and Shard of Alexander or Warrior Jar Shard, depending on where you are in the game, to further get more damage out of Mighty Shot and Lightning Slash. So I don't have Arrow's Reach Talisman in this build because I simply find I don't need the range from it. I have 50 range on my bow by default, and then Mighty Shot adds more range. So you don't really have a problem with range in this build. But if you don't have flight pinions and you're not crafting arrows with flight pinions, you might want to consider it. But I highly recommend when you're crafting arrows to farm flight pinions and craft arrows, lightning arrows, that use flight pinions so you can get extra range. Otherwise, your arrows just don't travel as far. And that is one thing I will mention about this build. There are no purchasable lightning arrows. And I believe that's simply because lightning arrows scale with dexterity, and every bow has dexterity scaling, potentially making them the best pound for pound damaging arrow in the game. Obviously, if you're going for status effects, that's a different case. But if you're just talking about per shot damage, every bow pretty much in Elden Ring scales with some dexterity, so they all get damage from that. To my knowledge, there are not very many or none strength scaling arrows. So dexterity has a bit of an advantage there compared to strength when it comes to arrows, and more specifically, the lightning arrows. So attribute-wise for this build, you're going to want to have at least 50 vigor in order to trade damage and not die. You are playing at range a lot, picking things off, so you could drop your vigor down a little bit, but I imagine if you're going into the DLC, you probably want at least 50. We have 25 mind here because we use Golden Vow, we use Mighty Shot, and we use Lightning Slash. We use all of these, and Golden Vow is quite expensive for a buff. So it really depends on how much you use Golden Vow. Mighty Shot's not super expensive. Lightning Slash isn't super expensive, and you don't use it all the time. So it really comes down to how often are you buffing with Golden Vow to get that extra damage. And the more you use that, the higher mind you might want to consider. The less you use that, the less mind you need. So if you're talking about this build early on in the game, you're not really going to focus on mind. You might want to have like 15, 20 mind, something like that. Then take this up later on in the game once you start using Golden Vow. Endurance, I have 25 for this build. You don't really need a lot of endurance for this build at all. You go through a lot of stamina using Mighty Shot typically. I mean, you do use some, but it's not a ton. And you're not spamming attacks the way a lot of builds are, just chewing through your stamina. So really, all you need enough is to be able to medium roll here with your armor that you're using. Strength-wise, I have 12 here. This is enough to two-hand the Nagakiba and meet the requirements for strength. If you want to be able to one-hand it, you need to take this up to 18. And you can do that, in my opinion. Sometimes it's really annoying to have to two-hand it, and it can save you time to not have to worry about that. So there is a case to be said for putting 18 points here. But because this is such a stat-hungry build already, I haven't put them. But probably, if that style of play is easier for you, then definitely consider doing that. So for dexterity, I have 83 here. This should be 80. You should set your dexterity at 77 with Okina Mask. This would become 80. Forgot to do that here when I was playing around with this build, but it should be 80 dexterity. It's going to get you the most damage out of your bow and the most damage out of your Lightning Nagakiba. You're probably going to get very little return after this, which is why I recommended going the Faith route to get Golden Vow if you're talking about the end of the game or New Game Plus to further boost your damage. You don't need any intelligence or arcane for this build. The intelligence I have here is simply from being an astrologer. So you do not need to focus on this at all. And if you played any other class other than Astrologer, you'd probably be lower level here, and your stat distribution would be a bit better. So for Flask of Wondrous Physique, you can go a couple ways. I really like Stamina Recovery, but if you're talking about early on in the game, you could go Dexterity to get more damage, or you could go the Lightning Shroud and Cracked here to get more lightning damage if you have your lightning setup going, or you could go a mix of both of those to get more damage. Both of those are fine, and again, Stamina Recovery really never hurts. It's kind of one I generally keep in there by default for a lot of builds. And when it comes to Great Runes, you're probably going to use either Godric's or Radahn's. You do have 6 stats you need here, depending on how much strength you want. If you're going to two-hand or one-hand, that really probably makes the difference between using Godric's or Radahn's. If you're planning on one-handing and you need that 18 strength, then I think it's a better case for Godric's than if you're not. Otherwise, you really only need 5 stats, and Radahn's becomes a lot, more likely because the FP, HP, and stamina, all those things are good. But because you need Faith, Dexterity, a little bit of Strength, Endurance, Mind, Vigor, you could also make the case for Godric's. So that wraps up our Samurai Sniper build. I hope you guys like this one. This is kind of a mix of a bow build and a Samurai. And in fact, this would be a natural progression for the Samurai build that I made at the very beginning of Elden Ring anyway, because it's Dexterity focused and just has more of a lightning theme. But it works well, and if you're looking for a bow to use early on because you don't have Albinauric's Bow because it's found very late game, you're just going to use the longbow. The longbow is the best bow that you can do this build with early on in the game, and then you'll switch that to the Albinauric's once you pick it up. As always, if you have further tips or questions about this build, please leave them in the comments below. And we do have more Elden Ring coverage coming. I'm working on the Seals video right now, then we'll do the Staffs next. And I also have a video coming out, I think today or tomorrow, about Elden Ring DLC preparation. You already have one video about that, but this one is going to be more specific, so stay tuned for that.
Bye.